honored to do this webinar. The Fire Science Consortium is a really exciting project, and I was thinking as Xander was doing his introduction that we really need similar consortia. It's such a successful model. We need similar consortia for other areas such as local adaptation to climate change on a region which is, like fire, quintessentially regional. And so very happy to be here today to talk about what I see as an emerging issue, which is the transition that is happening from traditional approaches to restoration ecology to thinking more about ecological resilience. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is three basic things. First, ask or review why we need to be talking about resilience at all. What's wrong with, what if anything is wrong with the traditional approaches of restoration ecology, especially in a fire context. Second, kind of drill into the concept itself, what resilience means, and what it offers that's new. And third, how we can map this onto land management and climate adaptation. And I'll just say up front that I've spared you a lot of the mathematics in resilience. It has a very quantitative side. We're not going to get into that today at all. And I should say on point number 3 that and I mean all of us, are just figuring this out almost as we go. And so how we apply these ideas to land management is really a work in progress in which all of you are participating. So the starting point for the motivation, quite honestly, I think that it's the period of rapid change that we're in that creates this need to develop not only a new vocabulary, but new ways of thinking about managing natural systems. And that's because if you assembled the kind of iconic images of our time, I mean, they might be images of war or people taking selfies, but certainly as far as Earth systems, it's these emblematic images of rapid, systemic, global scale change. And yet, we know that ecosystems have experienced periods of change in the past. On the lower left, a photo of aspen clones in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains taken by my colleague Ellis Margolis, indicating widespread high-severity fire at mid and upper elevations. And then in the right, upper tree line and very active tree line dynamics with a lot of tree lines advancing rapidly in the last 2 decades, and evidence that that is accelerating. And so the point here being that we know that ecosystems have the capacity to accommodate a certain degree of multi-annual, decadal, and even centennial scale variability in climate. And in fact, if we look back even farther in the Southwest into the pack rat midden and the pollen records, we see dramatic shifts in just the last 10,000 years, which, let's remind ourselves, is not that many tree generations ago for where we are. So I'm going to try the pointer here. So down here, for example, in the Sky Islands, we've had a pretty dramatic change from the vegetation types that are present in this part of the world compared to what was there at the beginning of the Holocene. And on the right is a reminder that this kind of variability in climate is something that we do see in the historic record, with occasional deep and severe and extended periods of drought. So if that's true, then why are we also worried? Why can't we simply look back into the paleo record and say, well, lots of variability there, deep multi-decadal droughts in the Southwest, for example, in the 1580s, that probably is the starting point for most of the age structure of the forests that we see on the landscape today, with a few exceptions. Why are we so worried? And there's no question that from some respects, the answer is both the magnitude and the rate of change, but it's also its irreversibility. So I've given 4 characteristics now. Rapid change, it's very abrupt. The irreversibility has to do with the persistence of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We're not simply riding out a wave that will pass in the next couple of decades. We're amping up the entire system for multi-decadal and possibly multi-century behavior. Substantial in the sense that the changes are ecologically significant and out of phase with natural dynamics. For example, without anthropogenic greenhouse gases since the late 1890s, we would actually be in a slight cooling phase right now, and so we're out of phase with what the Earth system would be doing. So to partition the impacts, we look at the panel on the left, which is a reconstruction of the anomaly, that is the departure from average precipitation in the West for the dates you see here, late November through late January. And at the time, as you recall, California was in pretty dire straits. If you compare the colors on the map with the color on the color bar, you'll see an alarmingly large area that was below 5% of its annual precipitation. And of course, when does Southern California get its precipitation for the year? It's this period exactly. Now, they got bailed out by some late season rainfall, but all that did is to push these areas up into the 25 to 50% below. And when 50% below your average rainfall is good news, you know that you're in a pretty dire condition. And then as far as the substantial part, on the right we see work by Mike Notaro, 2012 Ecological Applications paper, comparing the projected annual temperature, which is what's shown here on the right, by the end of the century, with the temperature recorded in the 20th century on the left. And you can see by the end of the century, there is no year that is as cool as the hottest years in the 20th century. Now, these are model results, and they assume certain behavior in the global climate system, and they certainly make assumptions about emissions, which we have something to do with. But the changes are very significant. How this ramifies then ecologically is manifested in several ways. And we're mostly going to talk about fire, but part of setting up the need to talk about resilience is the recognition that as we go into this warmer period, we have behavior that's especially driven by rising temperatures. So this is a very important paper by Williams et al., PNAS, about a year and a half ago. And what they show here, calibration with a tree ring record and a forest stress drought index, which then goes into very deeply negative territory by the end of the century. And the important thing is that it passes this threshold right here, which is the worst drought in the last 1,000 years. And so by the end of this century, we're permanently into that kind of drought condition. So this is part of what suggests that a traditional approach to restoration or even landscape management may not be possible. How this works out for fire is, of course, highly variable and subject to debate. Up until about 2000, we thought that a 50,000 acre was pretty big, and a 50,000 acre fire, and now, of course, fire sizes have increased by almost an order of magnitude. But interestingly, it's not necessarily fire size that is the main reason for concern. This is a reconstruction of area burned in the Rincon Mountains down here in the Sky Islands by Cal Ferris. And you can see there's a calibration of the fire scar data in orange right there against National Park Service Atlas here in the darker brown. And you can see the calibration is quite good. The fire scars in the Atlas have a high degree of agreement. On the basis of that, going back into the fire scar record in the 1700s, much more area burned on a decadal basis that we're seeing today. 2 to 4 times as much area burned. And in fact, we see this throughout the Southwest. So it's not necessarily the area burned. It's more likely to be the trends in severity. I'm just giving one example here from a group of papers that I've mentioned here at the bottom. I encourage you to look these up. These are mostly Sierras and Southern Cascades. But you can see here in every case the proportion of high severity, which is those dark bars, for all across most of the vegetation types, is increasing from the pre-settlement to the current era. And again, you see here the similar trend in increasing proportion of area burned in high severity. New Miller paper, Miller et al., 2012 paper, is a really good update of this if you want to check any of these out. And I can send along references on these. So therefore, we have this challenge in front of us that we can't simply manage ecosystems and including fire in the way that we used to, because primarily because of the changes in the climate system are going to make not only the fire regimes but the ecosystem response not analogous to anything we've had in the past. So that brings us then to ask, well, what does a resilience framework have to offer us at a time like this that we can draw on in order to maintain the sustainability of our ecosystems? Well, the starting point would ordinarily be a traditional restoration approach where you see even a deeply disturbed system such as the one in the upper left or these various gradients of disturbance, and then applying the tools and techniques of restoration ecology, you end up in a healthier and more sustainable state. Let me go back and do that again. Pick a panel and just watch it from pre to post. So this all looks pretty good, and it suggests that there are certain attributes of ecosystem disturbance that can be overcome by a very concerted and sometimes long-term and expensive efforts at ecosystem restoration. But the problem is that model assumes a stasis in a number of other axes of change, which we can no longer assume. So, for example, before the era of climate change, a deeply disturbed landscape like a coal strip mine would have some chance of being returned to its former vegetation, but that's assuming that the climate envelope is still present. As the climate envelope starts to move and we have invasive species, we have altered nitrogen inputs into the system, and as landscapes become converted and fragmented, all of the impacts that we see here, we take this group of impacts as a whole, and it begins to preclude some of the traditional outcomes for restoration ecology, at least in some cases. And this includes, in our case then, the need for more flexible responses, not only to fire management, but to post-fire management, which is one of the main things we're working on in our lab. So ecological resilience is a concept that has been in the literature for some time. You'll generally see it defined from as it is some variation of this first phrase here. It's actually originally derived from engineering, and this is where I said I was going to skip the math, but you can imagine the rate and trajectory of a system to return to some former state. But the important thing here is that resilience involves, and in some cases requires, a departure from the traditional approach to ecological restoration by relaxing the constraint to return to historical conditions. And I don't say this lightly as someone who's been working in ecological restoration my entire career. It's not easy to say, okay, there are some cases where the return to historical conditions is not adaptive or not possible. So this is a very, very significant boundary, watershed boundary in the conceptual framework for land management that we're passing over. And so it's not lightly that we would say, all right, the traditional approach to ecological restoration may no longer be up to the task, and we need to find a new model. So to review then the idea, how resilience differs from a traditional restoration approach, you'll often see this kind of ball and cup model, which is essentially a gravitational metaphor for behavior in space and time of complex systems. And, it has some intuitive appeal. We all know that the ball is going to tend to settle at the stable equilibrium, which is represented by the basin. And the ridges here mathematically are unstable equilibria, whereas perturbation either way can push the system into either state. The problems with this ball and cup model, however, are several. Okay, you still hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm hearing something. I'm hoping that's not my phone.
Sure what that is.
Okay, as long as you hear it too, it's not my phone. Okay, I'm just going to push on.
Okay.
Is that, yeah, I don't think it's originating here.
Sure is irritating. I think our one option, Don, is when you called in, did you call in using the moderator code?
I used the code that was in your number in the chat window, 675-6779.
Yeah. You know what? We could have you in, hang up and call back in.
Oh gosh. Okay.
with the 890 number.
890-8235?
Yeah.
Okay, and so I use the same number to call in?
Yep, and just use a different code, and then I can put the participants on mute and maybe get rid of the beep.
Okay, all right, we'll try that. Okay, I'll be right back.
Thank you. Sorry, everybody. It's one of the challenges of doing these online. You never know what kind of background noise we're going to get. We can all timing Don to see.
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Okay, I'll try muting. Now, Don, hopefully we can still hear you.
Yeah, I'm still speaking. Okay, are we good? Okay,
we're good. So continue on with boil and cup.
Right. Okay, apologies for that. So just briefly then, a couple of problems with this model. I mean, how would this help you? You're trying to manage a landscape, and you look at this and say, okay, well, what do I do differently? So several problems with this model that kind of leads us into, I think, a conceptual trap. One is that obviously it's a very one-dimensional model, as if everything we would want to know can be expressed by this one axis. And an example of that would be multiple species responding differently to fire and changing climate, not to mention multiple factors like vegetation, climate, insects. Most of the issues we need to deal with are much more multidimensional. Second, you notice the ball is rolling over a stable landscape where the whole problem is being created here by the landscape itself being unstable. And lastly, it's really unclear in this model whether change is something that's adaptive or something that's to be resisted. You see that you can roll into a different state over here, but is that a good thing? Or is really the whole idea to get back here? So, we need to look up for some more useful models. And I'll just show these images just to suggest that there are ways of conceptualizing resilience in ways that are different. So you can see in the panels on the left from this excellent article by Beisner et al. On alternative stable states that it's the landscape itself that's shifting around. You can see how the local stable equilibria are actually moving in parameter space here. And so that suggests what I think is really driving a lot of change, and that is it's the change in the topology, if you will, of ecosystems, not that the ecosystem itself is rolling around on a stable landscape. Okay, so a simpler way to frame this then is just to ask about the behavior of these systems over time. Again, the ball and cup model doesn't really inform our thinking very much about how quickly or slowly things happen, how persistent they are. So if you take a certain starting point state here, and I'm just using a kind of generalized ecological distance, so the farther away you get from this, the more different you are from your starting point along the x-axis, and then on the y-axis some indication of how long things are taking. And so the green arrows here indicate an example of what I think most of us would intuitively call a very resilient system. It doesn't stray very far ecologically from the starting point, and it comes back to that same point, and it happens quickly. Well, that's great if and when that happens. Those are the systems we don't have to worry about terribly. But a lot of systems don't behave like that. They undergo a period of a longer departure, and it's more ecologically different than the starting point, and it may take a while to cycle back. And a familiar example for most of this in the Southwest would be a conversion of a conifer stand to aspen, where you really go into a very different stand condition for some decades until conifers start to recruit back into the stand where that happens. But again, emphasizing here that there is this arc that seems to be bending back to the original stage. But what we're seeing a lot of now is behavior more like this, where the system seems like it's arcing, but it's really going into a new state. And once it gets out there, it's staying more or less permanently in a new resilient state. You can see it's highly resilient in its behavior out here in the new state, but it's crossed some kind of threshold, And that can be a combination of ecological and climate thresholds that prevents the system from returning back to its prior state. So this is the nature of the problem that we're facing. So the literature in this kind of behavior, of course, spans popular and technical, and I'd recommend both of these books if you're not familiar with them. Tipping point, obviously, is the inverse of resilience. A tipping point reflects a failure of resistance. And so the value of resilience theory, on one hand, is that it's a big box. It can hold a lot of different approaches to both understanding the dynamics of ecosystems and also to managing them. But that asset is also its primary challenge because it creates such a broad decision space that it's sometimes hard to get actual guidance of it. So if we say, well, we're going to let things change and evolve and they don't have to stay the same, well, that's great, but how much change are we willing to adapt to tolerate, and how much change do we think is adaptive? And so the challenge is making resilience theory more useful. So one way we can do this is by unpacking it a little bit, and I'll just go through these very briefly. So we can look at the spatial scale at which disturbance happens, the time scale of the response, and then the level of organization, which is essentially equivalent to that ecological similarity axis that I showed earlier. So we start to take resilience and disturbance apart a little bit in these by scaling it, and we start to get a somewhat more useful framework. So here's a little local fire event burning up in one of our study areas in the Jemez Mountains, and you can see not much is going to happen to forest structure, not much is going to happen to much of anything. This fire will probably be out by the end of the night. And so in this particular case, then, we would see that the time scale for recovery is really quick. Most individuals survive, and what dominates here is persistence. Most of the organisms, at least the macro scale, are persisting through a very small event like that. That's the actual ecological mechanism. Now let's scale this up to larger events with higher severity. This is a landscape we're studying intensively now, the Chiricahua Mountains, which experienced a 25,000-acre fire in 1994, and then a fire 10 times that size in 2011. And we're especially interested in the areas that were inside the perimeter of both fires, where we can look at sequences of unburned, low, moderate, and high severity in two events. And this is work that's part of Jesse Miner's dissertation here at the University of Arizona. So just to show briefly what's relevant here to this webinar, so the two letters you see here indicate the upper one is 1994, the lower one is 2011. And you can see there are highly variable responses. Down here in the lower right, we see that's pretty much bouncing back as aspen. Here on the lower left, we're getting a conversion to Gamble Oak. And in these upper sites, which as you can see in the background had a lot of overstory tree mortality, we seem to be tipping over into, at least for the time being, a grass-dominated phase. So this suggests that there are a lot of different potential trajectories when we have very similar starting points. And this is the connection to what's called alternative stable states theory in ecology. So in these cases then, the time scale for recovery can be much longer. It can be decades, multiple decades. The spatial scale of the disturbance can be much larger. And we're starting to actually see changes in the species mix and certainly turnover at the population scale. And this then is where we engage what are usually called recovery processes, such as post-fire succession. So we're no longer just dealing with persistence. We've actually killed some of the pre-disturbance community, and now it's a question of recovery. So what this recovery looks like can be highly variable. These are shrub-dominated, formerly dry mix conifer stands in the Catalina Mountains. These particular ones are right around in this area in the Catalina burn severity map, and you can see the kind of mohawk haircut of remaining forest up here where the crown fire did not occur. But then pretty much the rest of this landscape is converting over to one kind of shrub or another. And in fact, again, we see in the Catalinas the same diversity in outcomes. Here's a stand that, as we can see, with Lauren standing right there in the middle, bouncing back with pine very quickly. Here's a similar starting point, pine and dry mixed conifer that's shifted almost entirely to ceanothus and gambel oak. And then just to underscore the point that this is not necessarily a new process, these two photographs are taken in the same spot 100 years apart. And Forrest Shreve, who is one of the first outstanding ecologists of the Southwestern mountains, took this photograph about 5 years after what we think was a fairly high severity fire in this one small area of the Catalina Mountains. So this suggests that some of these tipping point type conversion dynamics are not necessarily limited to the climate and disturbance regime changes that we're seeing today. What this suggests to us is that fire has this ability, unique ability, to serve as a trigger for abrupt change. And in particular, this is occasioned when we have large, high-severity disturbances. And essentially what fire is able to do is to take a mortality pulse that might take a century, such as in the Williams et al. Graphs that I showed you earlier in the talk. And instead of that taking 100 years, it happens practically overnight. And so fire as the trigger or the agent of abrupt landscape scale change is emerging as an extremely important driver for the need to look at resilience, because as I think most of you would agree, a self-led recovery of this kind of system is going to be an extremely slow and erratic process. So in these cases where the disturbance has been more severe, we no longer have species persistence. We no longer have individual persistence. As you can see, pretty much everything is killed. And so different ecological mechanisms start to dominate. And one of those is the ability of species to recruit newly into a site. So if we look at the climate space of any one species, along the x-axis we see sort of the minimum growing season soil water potential. How dry do things get at the driest time? And then here, maximum growing season temperature. How hot do they get at the hottest time? And what you can see here is that for any given species, this is a hypothetical climate envelope, there would be an envelope of persistence for established individuals, which is significantly larger than what it takes to be a seedling. Seedlings are down here at the wetter, cooler corner of what any species can tolerate. That's all fine because in the past the climate variation would have intersected that space often enough that you would get successful recruitment. Indeed, that's what we think happened in the 19-teens when we have a huge recruitment of ponderosa pine and other dry mixed conifer species when we had one of these periods of favorable climate. But the problem is now the climate envelope is shifting out of that zone and may not intersect the regeneration niche infrequently, if at all. And if that happens, then we have the potential for a complete failure of the existing species to recruit because they can't regenerate. And that drives then an almost inevitable type conversion into a new community type. And these are the cases where we really think what's happening is likely to be a complete reorganization where you have entirely different plant communities, temporal scales. You know, I've said here hundreds of years, but maybe not really returning at all, and very large spatial scales. So we have all three of these mechanisms going on: persistence, recovery, and reorganization. And the question then becomes, well, okay, how can we apply these concepts to land management and to climate adaptation, and what will we do differently as a result? And as I'll say, all I can give here is a little bit of work that's going on in this area, but really this is why we wanted to do this webinar, is for people to begin experimenting and documenting a different approach other than the literal return to the pre-disturbance condition. So how do we map these concepts? I had said rare plants meant to be fire and ecosystem management. And in general, it's these three mechanisms that we just talked about. That is the ability for some element to persist through the change, including drought or fire, the ability to recover after there's been a disturbance, and then the ability to respond and reorganize. And I think you can see there's a kind of increasing gradient of severity here from the quick turnaround, resistance, and persistence pathways, which are the areas we're not really worried about too much, all the way down to the systems that are going to be completely reorganized, again, often with fire being the trigger for that reorganization. Well, the real challenge for us is that resilience means accepting change. And I don't mean to say that in restoration ecology we don't also think about change. Obviously, people do all the time. But resilience really puts change at the focal point, where the traditional approach to restoration put a kind of some degree of return to historic, functional, or literal authenticity at the center. But accepting change sounds great. You know, if I had do a little poll like Xander did at the middle, I would say, how many of us think change is good? We'd probably all say change is not only good but necessary. But do we really know what kinds and amount or degree of change is adaptive, and what degree of change is destructive of the very ecosystems we're trying to preserve? This is, it even understates it to say this is a non-trivial question. This is really the heart of the matter and the challenge. If resilience means we'll let certain things change in a way that we think is adaptive, do we really even know what that is? And I think that this is where we really need a lot more empirical work and experience coming from all of you to understand what kinds of change is adaptive and what kind is destructive. Second, how would this change the decisions we make on the ground? And thirdly, and again in a way most poignantly, does change meaning, in some cases, letting go of some current ecosystems? An example would be the spruce fir forest on the top of the Pinaleño Mountains. It's been there for thousands of years. It's ebbed and flowed. It's gotten bigger and smaller. The climate envelope models will tell us that it's not going to be there 100 years from now. And so do we exert heroic efforts to try to keep spruce fir on the top of the Pinaleños, or do we let it go? And if we start letting some things go, then where does that put us as conservationists? So some ways of thinking about change. We've all seen these maps of species range shifts. This is Engelmann spruce here that I was just talking about. You can see it's already kind of at the limits of its range down here in the Southwest, and where it's going to be according to a variety of climate models late century. On the other hand, of course, there are winners in these same scenarios. This is a species of mesquite that currently is mostly found in Mexico, and end of century could actually be quite widespread in the southern United States. So our species range shifts, we have to ask us, which means local extinction in some cases, an example of adaptation, in which case we should celebrate it, or is it something we need to fight and put up dams and dikes against and prevent if we possibly can? That's an unanswered question for all of us when we think about the persistence of plant communities where they are currently. The ability to persist is not something that we should, however, assume is completely captured in bioclimatic envelope models. The first line of defense really is this ability of species to tough it out. And one icon of this is a population of ponderosa pine that my colleague Jim Malusa found in Montrose Canyon down here in the Santa Catalina Mountains, below 4,400 feet. And that, in most parts of the Catalinas, is desert grassland. You may be just getting into oak woodland, and yet here's ponderosa pine found 2,000 to 4,000 feet below where it's usually found in the Catalinas. Now, admittedly, it's in a canyon. It's on a north slope, but it's a population of well-established trees. We haven't dated these yet, and it suggests that there must be, most likely, a genetic variation of ponderosa pine that can tough it out through extended drought. If that's true, then evolutionary theory would suggest that there is potential for expansion from this population in a period of warming temperatures. Okay, the second management option then is what I think most of us in the consortium do actively, and that is we try to improve the capacity of ecosystems of a range of different types to recover, which is to say to return to prior conditions. And this includes the work that we all do in in forest thinning and prescribed burning, trying to mitigate fire severity and extreme fire behavior, the reintroduction of species following fire, replanting efforts, invasive species control. These all, in one way or another, I would argue, are attempts to try to help ecosystems recover in situ, that is, without a shift in their geographic range, and to return to prior disturbance, to prior conditions after disturbance or climate stress. And I think that it's correct that most of our effort is applied here, because in the long run, the ability to maintain ecosystems in situ, of course, is far better to any of the alternatives. And this applies, I should say, not only to fire management, but to widely practiced across conservation biology in many, and restoration ecology in many areas, this ability to try to help things hang on where they are in situ. But there is that third category where we think that we've exceeded the persistence or recovery potential, and this is where Henry Gleason, the great ecologist of the 1920s and 30s, we really see the wisdom of his understanding of the individualistic nature of species responses to disturbance and change. And this is expressed by the conversions that are occurring already. Two cases here where we have a forest to grassland conversion, where basically the pinon experienced a severe dieback in the early 2000s. I'm sure most of you have seen this slide and similar slides. And so now we have a conversion from forest to grassland, but we see the opposite elsewhere, where as a result of warming and fire suppression, we're actually seeing woody encroachment into former grasslands. And so these transitions to new ecological conditions is not a new thing, and it's certainly not far in the future. It's happening. It's happening already. And so the question then, the questions we need to ask is at least these three questions. When I said earlier that not all change is adaptive, it's also true that not keeping things in their current condition may not always be adaptive. And again, I would take the example of the spruce fir and the pinaleños. It's possible that it may be better to look for other places for that plant community to persist, because we may be simply fighting against the tide, a tide of our own making, in the current distribution. Second, I can't emphasize enough that the mechanisms, the actual ecological mechanisms of resilience, are very poorly understood. They take us back to things that in the past we might have overlooked, like the question that I mentioned about seedling dynamics. And there are many, many other cases that govern, and plant genetics that indicate whether we are in a mode where persistence can dominate, where recovery trajectories in situ are possible, or whether reorganization, which includes landscape migration of species, are going to govern trajectories. These are, I think, very poorly understood what mediates the transition from one phase to another. And lastly, I would argue that we have the opportunity to use restoration to not only to make things happen, but if we think of it as trying to expand the resilient space in which ecosystems can do their own adapting. So rather than us shifting over consciously or otherwise to a mode in which we're kind of micromanaging landscapes, something that I think none of us really want to do, we think of ourselves as trying to expand the resilient space for ecosystems. So how can we apply this then to fire management? Well, I've pulled out from the discussions at the workshop and a lot of other discussions 3 ideas here that may be relevant as we work on adapting resilience theory to fire management. First is that restoring natural fire regimes, even though it's politically difficult and increasingly technically difficult to accomplish, we really should not let go of that as an objective. And the reason for that is very simply that the legacy effects of ecosystems today are very, very strongly rooted in the past centuries and even millennia. There's tremendous continuity in ecosystems that doesn't just go away because the IPCC or the National Climate Assessment comes out with a new report. The ecosystems have memory that are at least centuries and, again, probably millennia long. And to the extent that we believe that fire regimes are an integral part of those dynamics, restoring the natural fire regimes should still remain a central objective. And this goes along with the second objective, and I pull this out more specifically to say that because of this triggering effect of high severity, large high severity patches in particular, that avoiding high severity fire where it is outside the range of historic variability is probably the biggest single thing we can do to defer this role of fire in pushing ecosystems past irreversible tipping points. Obviously, we're not talking about avoiding high severity fire where that is the normal fire regime. That goes back to premise number one. But premise number two said that where we're seeing high severity, large high severity fires, where that is outside the range of variability, that is a critical factor because it's those high severity events that are tending to push a lot of ecosystems over the edge into a new space where persistence and resilience are pretty much off the table. And third, as I said, most challenging is understanding what kinds of change we want to accept that we consider adaptive and what change we don't. For example, we could look back at those slides that I showed from the Catalinas and say, well, we're getting a mosaic of post-fire effects. We're seeing everything that's going on is recovery or community dynamics involving native species. So we've got locust and aspen and ceanothus as well as pine coming in, and you could simply argue that whether the fire severity was out of the range of variability, at least the ecosystem has something to do, and it's doing it all with a suite of native species. I'm not saying we should be sanguine about those kinds of tipping point changes, but we shouldn't assume that we are wise enough to understand exactly where those ecosystems are going over decadal and century-long timescales. So to some extent, accepting, or perhaps we should say understanding ecological change may be the most important thing we can do as a community. I'd like to end just by thanking many, many people who have contributed ideas here. And again, it's been a real honor to work with the Consortium and as we all work on developing these new solutions in very challenging times. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Don. That was a great presentation, and I think helps move a little bit beyond the depression that some of those graphs can induce. So we have some time for questions, and people are welcome to type questions in the chat box, and I'll also go ahead and unmute the phone line, hoping the beeping is over, and you can just ask your questions verbally.
Okay, and I can see the chat line, so I'll be looking right there. And again, just to spur your willingness to write something, I think one thing you could do is share an example where you've seen a possible kind of tipping point conversion, especially something following fire, and what you think is going on there. Those would be very interesting. You're also shy.
Any questions out there? You're going to let Don off the hook so easily?
Hi, this is Sandra Hare.
Hey, Sandy.
How are you, Don?
Good.
Thank you for the really thought-provoking presentation. My question is, you won't be surprised at this at all, but, you know, all of these, I think, really great ideas about directions we need to go would really benefit from strategies that can incorporate spatial heterogeneity, you know, which is really has to be defined at various scales and from various perspectives, depending on what process we want to promote or encourage. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts on incorporating that sort of thinking into resilience efforts.
Yes. So, Sandy, thank you so much for that comment. And just because of the short time I had in this webinar, I couldn't get into that topic. But I'll say now that, well, first of all, if any of you don't know Sandy Hare's outstanding work on post-fire landscape dynamics, check it out. A series of really important papers that shows us that the spatial frame does matter. And an example of that would be our examples in the same event, the Las Conchas fire that I showed the kind of end game in Cochiti Canyon, but there were four other large high-severity fires with a significant high-severity component in that same landscape. And some of these areas burned once in the 70s or 90s and lost 80 to 90% of their tree cover. But that tree cover was constituted remaining seed sources and colonization islands, and therefore recovery potential for that landscape. The second fire comes along and eliminates those refugia, if you will, and now instead of having a percolated landscape with the potential for seed dispersal over hundreds of meters, you have no seed sources anywhere for kilometers. And that, of course, is one of the factors that causes this tipping point behavior from a potential multi-decadal recovery to a really unknown trajectory. So, Sandy, thank you very much for that comment. And I have a question from Sam Lofton about maintaining soil stability. So the comment is, should we be more concerned with maintaining soil stability and integrity and less with what is growing on it? Well, I could hardly argue with the premise that soil is one of those dominant factors. And in the models that we're building, both soils and hydrology rank up very, very high in terms of recovery potential. I guess what I would respond is that in the extreme cases, and again looking at if we all think about extremely high severity events on steep slopes where soil stability becomes the dominant factor, then absolutely that probably trumps anything else, including what vegetation or soil microbiota are present. But there may be a lot of other cases where that's not necessarily the driver. For example, in the Catalinas and many parts of the Chiricahuas, the soils remain relatively stable in some areas that are nonetheless tipping over into a new kind of vegetation. And so I would say that these are both potentially equally important pathways for resilience. But no question that in the extreme case of loss of soil stability and integrity, then pretty much everything else becomes impossible. And a question from Mary. When we were talking about forest resilience, most folks seem to be focused more on maintaining current ecosystems. Yet it seems that you are suggesting resilience actually can incorporate different forest conditions. How do we explain this to our cooperators? So thank you, Mary. That is a huge challenge, and the reason is twofold, I think. One, just as people, we all have a kind of mental baseline of what the landscape looks like. And it's non-trivial to say that if we were talking to someone right now who had been alive 1,000 years ago, they would have a very different mental baseline of what the landscape looks like. So our own impression of what things are, we kind of mentally equate, I think, with how they should be, except where we know that there's been damage. And so, therefore, there's a very strong kind of status quo gravitational pull, and that applies then to the second factor, which is the way most of our legislation is written. Simple, obvious example being the Endangered Species Act, which pretty much stipulates as the first and preferred method that we maintain rare species where they are currently in situ. And so both our mental habits and our laws, I think, tend to pull us to saying that returning things to the pre-disturbance condition is the preferred outcome. How to explain how to accommodate change in talking with cooperators, I think it's very difficult when we really, as a community, don't have a good understanding of that ourselves. When we look at these type changes that Lauren and Jesse and many of you are studying, is that adaptive change, or is that, tipping point in a negative sense, When we look at Ellis's documentation of large high-severity patches from the 1850s, we would call that probably adaptive behavior of the system. But it's quite possible if we had been walking in the Sangres in 1852, we would have been alarmed by the stand conditions that we saw there. So I think that before we can really explain this to our cooperators and say, don't worry, things are changing, but this is good change, we have to figure out what good change is, and I don't believe we're at that point yet.
Well, we're just about at an hour, and so if folks have to drop off, that's fine, but if other folks want to stick around and continue the conversation a little bit, we're also open to that. I do want to thank Don again. I think this is a very important conversation, and this webinar moves us forward a little bit. Other questions out there? Other comments?
Okay, well, if not, thanks everybody. It was really, really fun, really an honor to do this, and I look forward to carrying the conversation forward.
Thank you, Don. And we'll look forward to everyone joining on future webinars like the one on June 12th. So thank you very much, and I'll go ahead and close off the webinar.
Okay, thank you.